Hello everyone, welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. A quick announcement before we get to today's business. Robin Pearson, the host of the podcast The History of Byzantium, which has been going for many years now, invited me onto his show where we had a lot of fun talking about the 10 best Byzantine emperors, ranked from 10th to number 1. Obviously a very subjective exercise, but one that was shaped by the kind of experience that I gained by writing a 1,000-year history of Byzantium, looking at the big picture. Anyway, check that out if you want, but in addition to the rest of Robin's podcast. By the way, shout out to Robin. He's done a lot to bring Byzantium to thousands and thousands of people in an accessible, entertaining, and informed way. And I have had students in my class come up to me and say, I'm taking this class because I've listened to Robin's podcast. And so that's a tremendous service. So thank you, Robin. In fact, today's episode is devoted to and dedicated to a set of people who make it possible for us to have these communications, for us to have knowledge of the civilization that we study, and in fact, all history, but whose work often takes place in the background and isn't as recognized as it should be, especially by non-academic audiences, and I know a lot of you are non-academics. And I'm referring specifically to the editors who work at presses who publish our work. This is an absolutely crucial function for academic research. So publishing your work is very important, but there are also criteria of quality control and kind of gatekeeping and especially peer review that have to be implemented by someone. And while we all participate in that process, there is a kind of nexus where it all takes place, and that is the editorial process at a reputable academic press. This is important not only for the quality control and dissemination of knowledge, but also even for academic careers. Getting published is very important for that. And there are people who play a critical, if often unseen, role in that process, and these are our editors. A couple of years ago, I thought of inviting one of my editors onto the podcast to explain what I'll call the process. That is, how do you go about getting your book published in a major, reputable academic press? But right at that moment, I was preempted by one of my editors, Michael Sharp, at Cambridge University Press, the UK office, who released a video on YouTube, which you can go find if you search for Michael Sharp, Publishing Academic Monographs, which very lucidly explains the process. And Michael has done more than most people to promote and advance our fields in classics and Byzantine studies. He's the ideal person to do that. He is responsible for publishing very, very many books, monographs, edited volumes, and so on every year. So you should go look at that video if you're curious about what the process looks like. I also have in mind to do an episode on peer review, which is a very interesting, kind of fraught but necessary topic as well. I'm saving that for later. And another perspective that I wanted to get was that from inside the academic publishing house. As you can imagine, many of them, or all of them, have been subject to the same sort of financial pressures that everything else in the world has been. It is increasingly more expensive to do the work, that is, to produce the product, and the number of institutions and people who can afford it correspondingly decline, by which I mean library budgets are not as robust as they used to be, so librarians have to make difficult choices about what to purchase and what not. So all of this puts a lot of financial pressure on an institution that's not really designed to make profit in the first place, but has to at least break even and get by. And in this particular case, to do it by publishing fairly esoteric monographs on historical arcana. So this is a bit of a challenge. And I can't tell you how many times in all of the years that I have been in this profession, I've heard about the imminent demise of the academic monograph that would take with it the academic presses, or many of them, and so forth. And this demise in theory, would come about from a range of possible causes, from a switch in promotion standards from the monograph to a series of articles, from the financial inability of many presses to publish that many books, leading to a crisis in the profession because, as I said, our careers and kind of benchmarks of career advancement are pegged to publications and so forth. Fortunately, that has not happened. We are still facing all the crises that neoliberalism has brought to our profession, but as far as I can tell, our publishing system is not in fear of imminent collapse. And periodically, there are some very promising and exciting new initiatives and new projects, and we're going to speak with someone from one of those today. So specifically, there are very, very old academic presses, especially those that are affiliated with very old universities, especially university presses like Cambridge University Press, which goes back to the 15th century or something like that. But in addition to the university presses, there are also private academic presses. They do the same kind of academic work using the same systems, peer review and so forth, but they are private and not affiliated with a university in the same way. And one of the most interesting that has emerged in recent years is Archhumanities Press. My guest today is Anna Henderson, who is a senior acquisitions editor at Archhumanities Press, which I want to say is based in the UK, but as you will hear, its members are all over, and a very interesting group. And they've published a number of very interesting volumes. Yes, one of my own too. That's not why I'm saying that. But by all means, go to their website and see the very, very interesting topics that they've published on in a number of different formats, including your traditional monograph length book, but also a shorter book that I would call something like 30,000 words is the lingo, that is somewhere between a very, very, very long article and a very short book. And there are some topics that are appropriate for that format, and so it's very nice that they have those books. They're also very affordable, so that's a very nice format. So I thought it would be very interesting to get a perspective from Anna, precisely because this is a new publishing venture that a group of scholars managed to launch at a time that would not usually be considered very favorable for new academic ventures of this kind, but that has done a lot of very good work and appears to be quite successful. So kudos to the team at Archhumanities Press. So I will leave it to Anna to explain the rest. Anna Henderson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Anthony. It's great to be here.
Yes, it was a real pleasure to find you. And we made contact years ago when I published a book with your series, which many of my readers will know about. It's actually circulated quite a bit. And I really wanted to have someone on the podcast from the publishing side of things, and especially someone like you who is a scholar. You'll tell us all about that too. So you can tell us a little bit about the interface between scholarly research and publishing, because editors and publishers are one of the kind of more hidden aspects of the production of knowledge that, hidden, not hidden as, you're not trying to hide, obviously, but that general audiences know least about that part of the process, right?
Sure.
And I think it's very important that they know how scholarly knowledge is not so much produced as made available. And you're the people who facilitate that, and you play a very, very crucial and important role, not just in making the knowledge publicly available, but also in shaping it in all kinds of ways. And different presses do that in very different ways. And so I wanted to have your perspective here on the podcast. So why don't we start? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into academic publishing?
Yeah, great. That's a good place to start. I did an English degree originally, a long time ago. And I guess publishing is in some ways a sort of natural progression from an English degree. But I did toy with law for a bit. And I taught English abroad for a year in Hungary, which was quite interesting. But I sort of came back and thought, no, law is too much rote learning. I'm going to go for the more interesting option, which publishing seemed to be. and started looking around for a job. And eventually I managed to find my first job by bumping into someone at a Cocteau Twins gig. They were a 90s band who were playing down the road from where I was living at the time. And got talking to a chap who was a friend of a friend who happened to be working for this computer magazine publishing company. And it was almost like I was able to sort of pull out my CV from my pocket and hand it to him, because I'd been sort of preparing for publishing. And my parents' house happened to be just along the road from where the band was playing. And so on the way home, I actually popped in, got a copy of the CV, gave it to this chap, and he took it back to his boss the next day. And I got an interview on the strength of that, which was quite good fun. And it's one of those experiences that really shows how it's those personal, informal connections that can often get you jobs. I did that for a couple of years, and it was really good grounding as a sub-editor and just getting to know a bit about the technology of publishing, I guess. But then I moved on, and quite soon after that got a job working for University of Exeter Press. And that was really my first proper job in academic publishing, and worked well for me for several years. I focused in on the medieval studies after a while, having started off in production. And Exeter was well known for its editions of texts. And I actually got to go off to Leeds International Medieval Conference once a year. And I think at the turn, when was it? After about 10 years, in fact, I decided I wanted to go off and do a medieval studies MA. So I sort of took a career break from the publishing, and almost like gamekeeper turned poacher, as they say. And that was really, I think, inspired by going to Leeds and seeing all these medievalists together at the Congress. And I went and did a medieval studies at Manchester University, and got to dabble with manuscripts at the John Rylands library, and also to study history, which actually I hadn't studied at school. I jumped across to geography. So I'd done literature, medieval literature at university, but not history at all. So this was my second chance, I guess, medieval studies. And then I went on and did a cultural history PhD, which was inspired by the course on the Buyer tapestry that I did as part of my medieval studies MA. But I kind of took a reception approach. I actually looked at tapestries inspired by the Buyer tapestry, but created around the British Isles in the last 50 years, which not a lot of people know about, and no one had studied. And this seemed like a good form of public history to sort of look at and interrogate. And so I did that for 3 or 4 years, and grappled that into a thesis eventually. Though actually I find it quite frustrating as an academic publisher. I thought it should be easier to do a PhD than it turned out to be. It's, everybody has their trials and tribulations, I think, doing a PhD. And I certainly had mine, in that there was almost too much information to grapple into a sort of proper through argument to sort of make a proper thesis, I guess. But I got there in the end, and came out the other side. And,
yes, many colleagues face the problem of not having enough information, and some have the problem of abundance of information and trying to sort out what you need and want from all of it.
Yeah.
Did you have a chapter on parodies of the tapestry?
Not exactly, but one of the tapestries I studied did have definitely some comic elements to it. And I did sort of discuss comic aspects of the tapestries, because I think there is a sort of level in which they sort of they waver between comedic and parodic, and different different elements. It was interesting.
I sometimes use, I see it used in political cartoons.
Yes, yeah.
So tell us, how did you come to ARC Humanities Publishing, and tell us a little bit more about ARC.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so when I got out the other end of the PhD food chain, I didn't want to become an academic. I'd never really thought of myself as doing that, and I think perhaps more than some PhD students, I was very, very aware of how difficult it is, of course, to find tenure at the other end of doing a PhD. And so I'd been sticking my toe back in the water of academic publishing as I was coming out of the PhD. Worked for IB Tourist for a little bit, but they were taken over by Bloomsbury. And around about that time, Simon Ford at ARC started talking, and haven't really looked back since. ARC was an ideal move for me, really, to allow me to go back into the medieval sphere, which is what I'd obviously brought from Exeter. And ARC seemed like it was obviously the new kid on the block at that point. I think it was only about 4 years old when I joined. So I've sort of been there for half its life now. It's just under 10 years old now. And Simon had set it up, Simon having come from Breckles, and previously to that, he was the person who actually invented Leeds Medieval Congress, in fact, to counterbalance Kalamazoo. So he's someone who thinks outside the box, and that excited me. And he'd thought up this idea of founding ARC as a specialist pre-modern publisher, which that there aren't many of at all. And it was something where he'd become frustrated at Breckles in some ways by lack of knowledge of the academic sphere within academic publishing. And that was something that he felt he could bring to the table. And also wanting to focus down on that pre-modern subject area and allied subjects. The university presses, of course, in America and also in the UK have a much broader range. You know, they'll publish in medieval studies, but perhaps only 20 to 30 titles a year, your Penns and Penn States and the like. Whereas we've very quickly moved up and got 50 titles coming out almost a year, being able to really focus our energies on the areas in which we've got subject knowledge. And so I think we've become quite prominent within pre-modern studies quite quickly, even though we're small and even though we've only been around for 10 years, because we've got this critical momentum, I guess. And we've also got that good balance of having knowledge of academia. Nearly all, in fact, all the editorial staff have PhDs behind us, but also publishing expertise as well. So we've got that mix of academic and commercial. Mm-hmm. And we like to think that by bringing that to the table, we can, by knowing a bit about what you guys have going on, we can sort of help to focus our efforts in ways that help with the priorities that you have in terms of publishing. The other thing to say about ARC is, of course, it's part of an ecosphere, an ecosystem where in the last 50 years, we've gone from publishing perhaps 2,000 copies of one book at a time. You know, there was a far fewer books being published, but much larger quantities per title. And within those 40 or 50 years, that perhaps the average number of copies that you print of a book are more like 200. Wow. So it's a massive reduction in the actual quantities of books that we publish, we print. But the number of titles we publish across the board is far larger across all academic publishers. And that's partly That works for us because we need to publish more books in order to make the same amount of sales. But also it works for academics in terms of the pressure that they've come under to publish during that period. It's far more important to publish to get on, I think.
Yeah, so you have a very interesting catalog, and I have to say, ARC has emerged very dynamically on the scene of medieval publishing, and I include Byzantine studies in that. You have a very broad approach to the medieval. We'll talk about that in a moment. And I was actually just looking at your catalog just moments before we met today, and I saw a whole number of titles that I hadn't seen before, and I'm quite fascinated by. So I started filling up the cart, and then you appeared. Anyway, so you seem to have a number of a diversified approach to academic publishing. So some volumes are some of the smaller and much more affordable. Others are the more hardcover, pricier academic titles. Could you talk a little bit about the just the articulation of the publishing program? Like, how do you fit books into different categories?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, as an academic publisher, our primary book form is the academic monograph, I guess, and that's your hardback and digital form, relatively high priced, aimed at libraries. But right from the beginning, we also wanted Past Imperfect, which is the small books you're talking about, to be one of our calling cards, I guess. And that's something that's paperback is the primary form, I guess, although we do also publish it digitally. But it's $15.95 in pounds, a little bit more in dollars. And it's very much aimed at the individual reader. And we sometimes call them airport reading, in that they are a book that you could sit in the airport and say, I want to get to grips with this subject, and this subject. You buy your Past Imperfects, and an academic expert will lead you through the subject. And you, being a reader who might be a scholar in an allied subject or an undergrad or even a general reader, but your author will lead you through the subject and perhaps give a slightly idiosyncratic take on that subject as well. So we encourage our authors to be a bit more, think outside the box, rather than just, this is an introduction, these are all the sources, these are all the people who have written about this before, and I have no opinion. We want you to put your opinion in there. That's important.
That's very nice.
Yeah. But in terms of who we encourage to write for what, it's a mixture, really. I mean, we certainly thought of the Past Imperfect series to begin with as something where we invite you, as in scholars who are already experts in their field, to write books for us. But gradually we've invited people to come to us with proposals to some extent, because there are gaps in the subject's coverage that we haven't necessarily filled, and an expert in a subject might not necessarily be a senior scholar these days. So yeah, we're a bit more inclusive. And then, we like to think that possibly the same scholars might also write a monograph for us at some point as well. So there's, it depends on what you're writing on and when. The other thing I should throw into the mix is that we increasingly talk to scholars about the possibility of writing mini-graphs for us, which are obviously somewhere in between a Past Imperfect, which is about 35,000 words, and your monograph of 80,000 words or more. The mini-graph sits at the sort of 50, 60, 70,000 words total, depending on what the subject requires. And it's a book form that's interesting. I think often people haven't really thought about this, but it's a form that might, with the increasing interdisciplinarity that many scholars embrace, you might have a main field that you're writing a monograph on, which might be, you might be chipping away at over the years, but you might have other research areas that you're also interested in, perhaps you've written an article or two over several years, and you might feel that there's more to say about that subject, but not something that you'd want to extend to full monograph level. And a mini graph might satisfy that need, in a sense, for you and for the readership. And so we encourage people to think about that as an option. It's also an option for people who perhaps are involved in a big European Research Council funded project where there are lots of outputs planned, perhaps a couple of edited volumes, perhaps articles, but you as PI or as a postdoc perhaps might feel that your findings have grown into something more substantial over the course of a project. And you might feel that minigraph is a good format for that, to show that, you know, what you've got out of it is more substantial and what you've been working on. And a third way I think that format's useful is perhaps as a way of rethinking the PhD to book conversion. Because often I think, having done a PhD myself, that there might be 2 or 3 chapters that really shine within a PhD, or 1 or 2 that are really original. And I think, especially if you've gone away from your PhD for a couple of years and then you've come back and read your thesis with fresh eyes, being a bit more ruthless about shaking it up, taking those really central chapters, reframing them with new introduction and conclusion, perhaps adding a chapter of research that you've done since that ties it all together, that can make for a much more coherent approach to using your thesis than the sort of traditional, again, I use the term chipping away at the PhD, the thesis, to make it a more readerly experience, shall we say.
Anna, you're exactly right. And the way the minigraph idea is excellent. And I remember when I was, I don't know, a late undergraduate student, early graduate, whatever, and I was becoming familiar with the modes of academic publishing. And it struck me as odd that academic knowledge was expected to fall into 2 categories: articles that are like 12,000 words or less, and monographs that are like 80 or 90,000 words or more. And at the time, because I was naive and I was not yet sort of professionalized and socialized enough to not see the problems, I wondered, so what happens to everything in between? Like, this doesn't seem like a natural division. It seemed to be much more one driven by different like modes of physical publication, like the journal volume and the monograph. And so what happens to everything in between? And as a result, you get what is essentially a minigraph published in like 4 or 5 different articles scattered throughout the journal, you know, ecosystem, or a minigraph that's been padded out with just superfluous material to make a monograph. And anyway, so I hope that this model works, it proves fruitful, and because it seems to fill a very logical niche that, you know, anyway.
Yeah, sure. And we still publish those books in hardback and digital, and libraries are the primary market for those. But we always have an eye to what we might paperback further down the line, because I do think that's an important part of our model. Again, you know, we see ourselves as a bit like a university press in all but name, but we also take sort of elements from the European model of publishing, your Brills and your Breppels, who publish larger quantities of medieval studies books, but they have traditionally been resistant to the paperback, I think. You know, they tend to publish a lot of high-priced edited collections and monographs and not want to paperback. And we want to be useful to the individual reader as well as the library, although, you know, we acknowledge freely that libraries are our first market, but we want to be able to bolt on other things and cater to what our individual readers need as well.
So I'm very glad that press that's focused on, you know, medieval knowledge, publishing about the medieval world is managing to succeed the way you are. Can you tell us a little bit about the pressures that academic publishing is generally under these days? And how are you responding to those? I don't think our audience knows. Every sector of the economy is under pressure.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what exactly is going on with academic publishing?
Well, certainly, as you say, the rising costs thing is something that is affecting the whole world, I guess, at the moment. And so that's not specific to publishing. The falling sales issue is something we've touched on a little bit already. The fact that the average number of sales per monograph is far lower than it was. And in a sense, all publishers have had to sort of embrace efficiencies in one way or another, I guess, in order to help deal with that issue. And in some ways, we've been helped by the fact that technology has allowed us to print in smaller and smaller quantities and still make a monograph viable. Because I think 20 or 30 years ago, or longer ago probably, people started predicting the death of the monograph, a dire circumstance. And yet that hasn't come to pass, partly because of this business of us all publishing more in order to stay still in some ways. But yeah, efficiencies are important. And ARC, it's been useful. ARC's model of making efficiency is that it's always been a remote publisher, or almost always, since very early on, in that we all are scattered around the world but come together to meet, not quite weekly, but we have a series of meetings that sort of pull us all together. And we meet physically at Leeds and Kalamazoo sometimes as well. And we managed to be a tight team as well as being based in America and the UK and Australia. And that means we don't have the overheads that your legacy publishers have. The irony being that, of course, we were remote before COVID, and then COVID enforced remote on an awful lot of other publishers. And that many of those have gone back to sort of hybrid model since, I think. But we sort of thrive and flourish on it, which is good. So the other thing, I guess, that the other big thing that we're all always come to terms with is changes in digital technology and how those affect publishing, and also that whole publishing and institutional library interface, because libraries have, of course, very much become purveyors of digital information to their readers. Almost the book as a physical object is almost an aside these days, which is a terrible thing for a publisher to have to say. But I'm thinking in terms of the big journals, of course, which really exist online as their main source. And so we as publishers have obviously come to grips with ebooks, the digital form of the physical book. And there, we often get people saying, well, surely that makes things cheaper for you. Well, it doesn't really, because we still need to produce the physical form as well as the digital alongside. So it's a bit like you guys hybrid teaching during COVID and having to offer more and to stay still in a sense. So yeah, I mean, the digital form is obviously an important part of what we do, and digital sales increased a lot over COVID. I think it allowed libraries to really embrace that form, and also just to save on shelf space, of course, at the same time. So it means that they can offer more books by being able to offer some in digital form or in both.
So,
go on.
Can I ask about the declining sales that you mentioned? So a couple of major factors that I can think of are declining university library budgets. That's just a function of the kind of austerity that they've been under for a long time. And also the arrangements among libraries to share books. Back in Ohio, we had Ohio Link, which was a very efficient system of sharing books among all the different universities in the state. So that decreases, right, the absolute number of copies that the system as a whole buys. Are there any other major drivers of the decline in book sales?
Yeah, there's another thing a little similar to this, which is that aggregators offer something called patron-driven purchasing, where often libraries are listing and cataloguing books to the readers, and for the readers, to all intents and purposes, they're on offer. The library offers those books, but until the reader actually clicks through and opens that book and uses that book, you know what I'm going to say.
Yes.
We, the publisher, don't receive anything at all. And often not until a particular threshold is reached in terms of number of readers, I believe. I think there are all sorts of models based on this sort of system these days, which, yeah.
I did not know this.
They give
I did
you
not know
pause
that
for
system
thought.
existed. Wow.
Yeah.
There's data for you.
It is data for you, you're right. And it's interesting that, we've known about that for quite some time. But what we have found is that the only thing you can do is embrace this and make sure that you have relationships with as many of these different intermediaries as possible, because different libraries are signed up to different intermediaries, or they might offer more than one, and your book needs to be coming out of the hat in as many different varieties against different lists of medieval studies and other subjects as possible, because that way it's more discoverable and people are more likely to click through. And so it's about making sure you've got very rich metadata and accurate metadata being disseminated at all times, and particularly at certain parts in the publishing cycle for each book, and making sure you really put your feelers out and make sure you're on all those databases.
Right. This explains why the presses have been asking me lately to provide much more metadata about each chapter in each book. Yes. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, got it. So what are some of the major differences between ARC and what you've called an academic press? So, I mean, in terms of constraints or advantages or disadvantages that you have in relation to the academic presses, so you presumably you don't have offices provided on a university campus or something like that, but what are some of the other main structural differences?
Yeah, I'd still call us an academic press, but not a university press.
Sorry,
I guess.
my mistake. I meant university presses.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. You'll replace academic with university in that question. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess the difference is, or rather the similarity is, that we still peer review every book proposal that comes through and every manuscript that is submitted. But we don't have to, I suppose, refer up the line to some university board, some internal board, which I think a lot of the university presses have to do to have final sign off of a book. So we rely on our internal expertise plus peer reviewers throughout the world to deal in those matters. And the other thing is that it means we're not subject to slash and burn university policies when it comes to their university presses. I think in perhaps not so much recently, but perhaps 10, 15, 20 years ago, I know that quite a lot of North American universities sort of cut radically their university press budgets, and so sometimes that then resulted in there would be a great list of people signed up with their books waiting to be published, and a great backlog in terms of the publishing process, because the press had been cut in terms of what its ability to publish a forward list. So that's quite interesting. We don't have to worry about those sort of vagaries of changing of
Yes.
the guard, shall we say, in terms of policies within universities.
Yeah.
Equally, we don't have shareholders because we're a small, independent run
Right.
press, but also we don't have big investors. So we have to be very careful and pragmatic about everything.
Yes.
And really think hard about what we're publishing and how we're publishing it.
Yes. And board of trustees telling you how much alcohol you can have serve at a meeting or something like that. They seem to be very interested in that question in the US for some reason.
Well, you see, if you're working remotely, the alcohol, you
Yes,
can't.
that's right. Yes, that's what she was. Yeah. So tell us about Byzantine studies in particular. So where do they fit into your list as a whole?
Okay, so I think the thing to say here is that right from the beginning, we've not wanted to shoehorn Byzantine into a particular series. We're very much happy to see Byzantine pop up in different series across the press. So a material culture or cultural heritage title might be in our Common Visual and Material Studies series or our Cultural Heritage series. What else have we got? Oh, we've got a book on the Battle of Manzikert coming out in the next year or so, and that will be in our War and Conflict series. And then there's obviously the past imperfects, which we've talked about a bit, and you yourself have published within. And that past imperfect series is one of the perhaps the nicest fits for Byzantine studies, in that that series, together with another one which we call Beyond Medieval Europe, are very much embracing of the idea of wanting to go beyond traditional ideas of the medieval West, and that have focused on Britain and bits of Western Europe, and counterbalance that sort of traditionally sort of Anglo-centric and Western European-centric focus, I guess.
Yes, you have done a very good job with that. So congratulations on my part. In fact, the very first episode of this podcast was on a book from the Past Imperfect series.
Is that the Leonora Neville?
That's right. Yes, yes. And I should actually go back and look at that series again, because it's been now over 3 years, and those books are ideal even for the podcast medium, because I can recommend them to the audience as something that they can reasonably get through in their busy days, because they're not academics. So what's the rationale behind the Beyond Medieval Europe series? What's beyond, like, you mean beyond like the French queens and British nuns?
Yeah, I mean, it's beyond medieval Europe, and in a sense, medieval Europe has quote marks around it. So it means beyond traditional ideas of medieval Europe, a more expansive perspective on it, because Central and Eastern Europe in particular have had a raw deal, I think. Byzantine studies, the East, even Scandinavian studies to some extent has been a little undersold, I guess, because I think one of the people who explains this best is Christian Raffensperger, who has written for the Past Imperfect series, and in fact was one of the founding editors of the Beyond Medieval Europe series. In being someone who really wants to sort of expand that rather subjective and partisan attitude towards what's in and what's out. And I know you talked to him about, Europe doesn't even look like a continent on the map, and where are the ends, where are the edges, in a previous podcast. And I think it is very instructive to just sort of think beyond those traditional bounds and invite material from different, broader allied territories, which they just were sort of sidelined in discussions of medieval Europe originally.
Yes, and specifically in early modern discussions of medieval Europe, and that's kind of when these kind of paradigms emerged. So if there's a scholar of Byzantium out there and is interested in submitting a proposal to you, what kinds of topics are you mostly interested in? Or what would make for a good proposal in your eyes?
Material culture is something we're interested in. Anything that looks at sources, new sources, I guess, new and interesting ways into history, such as looking at the archaeology and the history, putting them together, perhaps looking at law and reinterpreting that. We've got Nathan Lightholm has written a book for us on elite Byzantine kingships, and he is writing a second book for us, and he's very much working with the legal documents, I think, to look at what can be explored in terms of families and their relationships to the slave and slavery, and sort of unpicking the assumptions that seem to be sort of underlying what's actually in legal documents of the period. Fascinating.
Yes, so there's a lot of material that has its own very specialized discussions. So you mentioned material culture, material history, which obviously there's a lot that's being published by, with lab results and in technical archaeological journals. And the same for law. It is a long-standing technical discipline, but it kind of operates in its own kind of esoteric jargon and with, scholars who are talking only about legal texts. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that, those materials can be brought out from their more technical discussions and talked about in relation with social history, like, put them into motion rather than talking about how just one text is influenced by another, and you stay within this kind of genre domain.
Sure, in the same way that literary texts were originally just seen as literature, but then we've moved to thinking about, but what else can they tell us? What can they tell us about culture? What can we derive from them in terms of cultural history? Yes. So it's loosening the bounds of how we look at texts and other materials, I guess.
So since you've seen the process from both sides, as an academic, you wrote a PhD, and as someone from within publishing, what are some of the more common misconceptions about academic publishing that you would like to clear up here? So are there myths that you keep encountering over and over again, and you're having to say, well, no, actually?
That's a lovely question, in fact. I guess the biggest myth is what we earn from the price of a book, because academics do tend to throw up their hands in horror at the price of your average academic hardback. For instance, £99 is kind of the starting point at the moment for ours. It sounds like a lot of money, but what not a lot of academics know is that we get barely £50 of that back to the publisher. And I think that's quite eye-opening, that 50% of it gets dispersed to other intermediaries in the process of publishing a book. So the intermediaries who take a cut are the marketing and distribution and the fulfillment of sending out the books, but also the library agents, people like EBSCO, and of course Amazon takes a large. Yes. And so all those bodies slice their own little bit off, and we might get barely £50 from a £99 book. And of course, if you then apply that to a past imperfect, which is just under £16, that means we get just £8 back. So I don't think I've actually said, but I did say earlier on that we're publishing about 50 books a year, and they're a mix of past imperfects and monographs and mini graphs, which are priced less than the monographs, but not that much less. But if you think about that and the sort of quantities I've talked about us actually selling per book, we're not all earning enough money to go and buy a Mercedes. You can see very quickly. Yeah, but it's especially for small monograph publishers. We're not doing it for the money, we're doing it for the love, honestly.
Yes. So just to clarify, the 50% return, that's not your profit margin. That's to cover expenses.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, after the £50 back in the pocket, you then have to cover our salaries, cover the printing, and all the other overheads from from what's left. So it's yes, yeah.
No, because a 50% profit margin would be something incredible.
No, absolutely, yes, that's absolutely not that at all.
Yes, no, it's much less, and yeah, that. So, tell us also a little bit about open access publishing, because I mean, just to be honest, on the academic side of things, I think open access is, has a sort of moral high ground if you're making the argument like, we want the knowledge that we produce to be as available to anyone. From the author side, we don't make that much money, from publishing. That's not why we do it, same as you. Mm-hmm. And, we kind of want it to be out there. Now, the process of, creating, fashioning, packaging, and publishing has expenses. And this is obviously why we pay for books and pay for everything. But ideally, we would like it to be just available for everyone. And a number of publishers have made some moves in that direction, but obviously there are sort of economic constraints there. How do you see open access? What are the opportunities and challenges for you there?
As you say, on the surface, it's a greater good, but it's something where there isn't equity in the field for all, in that you yourself could choose fairly easily as a tenured professor as to whether you wish your book to be published open access or not. And you'd be able to provide institutional funding, presumably, possibly. But an early career researcher or an independent scholar won't have access to the sort of funding that's required for open access. And publishers do have to cover their costs, whether a book is open access or printed, or published traditionally, rather. Yeah. And so somewhere that cost needs to be covered, and we see that as something that we'd like to redress where possible. So we have various schemes in place that sort of try to privilege early career researchers by producing a pot of money that allows us to fund at least one of those a year. But it's in the end, the system operates with financial scarcity, and there's never going to be enough money to publish everyone's book open access, I guess. Also, if you made all publishing open access, you'd in effect be sort of blunting the instrument of the publisher's commercial expertise. You'd be reducing all risk and saying everything can be published, whatever, I guess. I mean, not whatever, because the scholarly rationale would still presumably be built into that, but a book can exist that is perfectly worthy in scholarly terms without it actually having a readership, can't it? Right. And so if your book is in the library but no one wants to take it out, arguably should it have been in the library?
Yeah, the best model that I've come across and I'm involved in when it comes to open access is for technical journal publications. That is a lot of the foundational work that wouldn't be commercial, but needs to be out there for the purposes of research. And so the two models that seem to make most sense here are some usually European academic institute that is funded, usually by a government or something like that, that produces its own journal and puts it online. As you can almost see it as an extended sort of government service. It's, part of what you get with your taxes is research in this and that field. And the other one is a group of scholars who decide to, put their own time and labor and sometimes resources in publishing a journal online without it, being owned by a press. So, for example, Greek, Roman, and Byzantine studies that I'm on the board of, all of the articles are published online. They're free and available, and there are some people who do a lot of work to make that happen. But I'm hoping that this model doesn't compete with yours at all. I mean, these are the articles that are cited in the footnotes of the things that you publish.
Yeah, I think that's something to say about open access, is that it was conceived really with the journals in mind, and originally with the scientific journals in mind, and it carries over to humanities journals, and the sort of thing you're talking about is exactly right and exactly what it should be used for. But yes, it does fit slightly uneasily with monograph publishing, especially in terms of the fact that the funding for open access for monograph publishing seems to be a bit of an afterthought in certain parts of the world. I mean, I think Europe has embraced it, but the UK and the North America, it's more patchy in terms of how the funding streams are available, or if they are available at all. It will depend very much on what sort of university you're at, how it's funded, size.
All right. Anna, we have time for one more question here, and I want to look to the future. So what do you see as the challenges that are coming to your field? What is ARC doing either to prepare or to just create new opportunities and new models for itself?
I think we've covered some of that already, in a sense, in that the minigraph format is definitely something that I see more academics embracing going forward, and that we're very much happy to facilitate. So that's a sort of key tenet, and that's keeping an eye on what individual readers want to read, as well as what libraries need. So paperbacking where we can, the hardbacks that we produce first for libraries, and accessibly pricing them, I guess, is important as well. They have to be paperbacks priced towards the individual user. And just keeping an eye on the field, really, on new and emerging current scholarship, and helping to facilitate that by establishing new series, talking to academics, and sort of using our size as a form of agility in responding to what's going on in academia.
You're exactly right. And I think that your mention of the individual reader is very important here, and we mustn't lose sight of how important they are, and that they are still a viable market. They're very interested in history. There are a lot of people who are interested in history, and I think it is a responsibility on the part of scholars, especially tenured scholars, to produce their knowledge in a way that is accessible to the general reader. And this is something that will also benefit you, because you can then sell books that are more affordable in larger quantities to those readers. And so there's a time when you do esoteric technical research, and there's a time when you make it available to the general public. I think it's a responsibility that authors also have.
Yeah, and I think it helps concentrate the mind of the academic writer to think about the individual reader, and that plays into all the things we're talking about here. That not losing sight for neither the publisher nor the author should lose sight of the end reader.
Yeah, I had to keep that in mind when I was writing this very big general history, that everything had to make sense in the end to the general reader, even if I threw up my hands in despair at some problems and like, well, I'm not sure how to push forward with this, but maybe I'll clarify what the problem is. Anyway, Anna, that's a great place to end this. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, and also for the very important work that you do. ARC is an amazing phenomenon of the past few years, at least in my field. I was just scrolling through all of your titles, particularly before we started this meeting, and I'll go back to doing that right now. So I encourage everybody listening to take a look at your catalog, ARC Humanities Press. There's so many interesting things that you're publishing. So thank you from all of us.
Thank you, Anthony.